The Brandywine Creek Valley in Newcastle County, Delaware, in 1868 was one of the most industrially dense stretches of countryside in the eastern United States, a narrow corridor of fast-moving water that had been powering mills for more than 100 years. The DuPont powder works were there, and the paper mills, and the flour mills, and the woolen mills, and the iron works, and the tanneries, and between all of these the farmland and woodlots, and small holdings of the people who lived in the valley year-round, rather than owning the mills or working in them. Delaware was a small state, and Newcastle County was its most populated corner, and the Brandywine Valley had the specific density of a place that had been settled continuously since the 17th century, since the Swedish colonists who came to the Delaware Bay in 1638, and whose presence was still detectable 230 years later, in the names on the deeds and the construction methods of the oldest buildings. Ruth Swanson was 44 in 1868, widowed 2 years before when her husband, Carl, had died of a fever contracted at the paper mill, where he had been a rag sorter for 16 years. She had the 12-acre holding they had farmed together on the west side of the Brandywine, 3 miles above Wilmington, and she had her daughter Ida, who was 19, and she had the income from the rye and potatoes and the kitchen garden and the 2 cows, which was enough to stay on the land if she managed carefully, and not enough to make any mistake with. The wood problem had been present since 1864, when Carl's health began declining and the work of cutting and splitting fell increasingly to Ruth and to Ida. Delaware was not a cold state by the standards of the American frontier. The winters along the Brandywine were nothing like the Dakota Territory winters or the Keweenaw Peninsula winters, but they were real winters with real cold and real ice, and the household required 1.5 cords of wood through the season to keep the kitchen stove and the parlor stove burning adequately. 1.5 cords cost between $5 and $7 at the Wilmington wood merchants, which was money she preferred to keep, which meant cutting it herself from the woodlot on the northeast corner of the 12 acres, a stand of mixed oak and hickory that Carl had managed for firewood production through selective cutting, never taking more than the stand could regrow in 5 years. The specific problem was not cutting the wood, it was keeping it dry. Delaware winters were not primarily cold, they were primarily wet. The precipitation pattern of the mid-Atlantic coast produced rain more often than snow, freezing rain and ice storms more often than blizzards, and the persistent dampness that comes from a climate where the temperature fluctuates around the freezing point for weeks at a time, rather than dropping to sustained cold and staying there. Wood that got wet in October and did not dry out before December was wood that burned poorly in January, giving less heat per piece, requiring more frequent feeding, covering the stove glass with creosote, and sometimes going out in the middle of the night when the fire needed to hold. Carl had kept the wood in an outdoor pile along the south wall of the house, the standard arrangement, the arrangement every neighbor kept, the arrangement that the family had used since they came to the holding in 1851. The pile got a rough tarp over the top in wet seasons, but the tarp shifted in the wind and never covered the sides. And after a winter ice storm that coated the pile in 1/4 inch of clear ice, the wood underneath was wet for days and burned accordingly. Ruth had been thinking about the covered shed since 1865. The first winter she managed the wood alone after Carl became too ill to cut. She had noticed in the autumn of 1865 that the wood she cut and split in September, when the late summer heat had already dried it, burned better in November and December than the wood she cut in October and November, which was still holding moisture from the autumn rains. She had also noticed that the small amount of wood she stored temporarily under the porch overhang, the pieces she brought in from the main pile a few days before using them, dried noticeably over those few days of covered storage and burned better than the pieces she took directly from the uncovered pile. This gave her the principle: wood that was kept out of the weather for a period before burning was drier wood. The question was how long and under what conditions. She began keeping a rough record in the farm account book in October of 1865, which wood came from which location, what the burn quality was, how long the piece had been under cover before burning. The record was not precise in the way that the temperature notebooks of Clara Whitmore or Marta Ojala were precise. It was a farm account book that also tracked cow productivity and seed purchases, but the pattern it showed over 2 seasons was clear. Wood kept in the covered porch alcove for 7 to 10 days before burning was significantly drier than wood brought directly from the uncovered pile, even if both had been cut at the same time. and would cut in late summer and stored covered through the autumn was the driest of all. The problem with the porch alcove was space. It held perhaps a quarter cord, which was enough for a week at the height of winter consumption, but not enough to buffer against a prolonged bad weather period when she could not comfortably go out to the main pile. The main pile was uncovered because covering it adequately had always seemed like more construction than the benefit justified, a sentiment Carl had expressed and that the neighbors held as a general matter, because everyone's wood was outside, and everyone's wood was sometimes wet, and that was simply the condition of winter wood. She decided in the spring of 1867 to build the covered shed. Before Carl died in August of that year, and the decision was hers rather than theirs, she had proposed it. He had agreed it made sense, and she had planned the design through the summer of 1867. His death in August meant she built it alone. With Ida's help, in the autumn of 1867, the shed was 14 feet by 8 feet, with a shed roof sloping from 8 feet at the south wall to 6 feet at the north wall, built against the east side of the barn where it would get the morning sun on the south face and be sheltered from the prevailing westerly wind. The walls were of rough sawn chestnut boards from the Brandywine sawmill. The American chestnut was still abundant in Delaware in 1867, before the blight, with gaps of 3/4 of an inch between the boards on all 4 sides. The roof was tight, overlapping chestnut shingles that Ruth split herself from a straight-grained bolt of chestnut, overlapping by 3 inches, sealed against the weather. The gaps in the walls were deliberate. This was the specific element that distinguished the shed from a barn or a closed storage room. The walls admitted airflow, would rise through the movement of air across its surface. In a closed space, the humidity expelled by the drying would accumulate and slows the drying process. In a space with ventilating gaps, the expelled moisture moves out with the airflow and is replaced by drier outside air, keeping the drying process continuous. Ruth had not read about this principle in any text. She had observed it in the porch alcove. The alcove had gaps in its siding, and the wood dried faster there than in the closed shed she had briefly tried in 1866, using the corner of the barn, where the humidity built up and the wood smelled of mildew. The open gaps worked better. She made the shed walls with gaps. The floor was 12 inches off the ground, on hewn oak sill beams set on flat stones, with split rails laid across the sills, perpendicular to the wall. The air gap between the floor and the ground prevented the ground moisture from wicking up into the stored wood. The stones under the sill beams prevented the sills from rotting in contact with the soil. The sills were of oak, not chestnut, because oak heartwood resists rot better than chestnut in soil contact, a distinction Carl had taught her in the first years of the holding. She stacked the wood in a specific way, split wood only, no rounds. Rounds unsplit logs hold moisture in the pith at the center and dry from the outside in, which is slow. Split wood exposes the interior to air on the cut faces and dries from both surfaces simultaneously, which is faster. She split everything before stacking and stacked it with the cut faces alternating, not all cut faces in or all cut faces out, but alternating, so that the airflow that came through the wall gaps found cut surfaces throughout the stack rather than only at the ends. This method she had worked out by observing which pieces in the old outdoor pile were driest when she took them. The pieces at the ends of the pile, where the cross-stack air movement was greatest, were always drier than the pieces in the middle. Alternating the cut faces throughout the stack approximated the end stack condition everywhere. The roof overhang extended 12 inches beyond the north and south walls, which was enough to prevent rain from driving in through the wall gaps in ordinary weather. In heavy rain with a strong southerly wind, the most common storm direction in Delaware, the overhang was marginally insufficient on the south side, so she added a 12-inch apron of overlapping chestnut shingles to the bottom of the south wall, attached to the wall sills and angled outward. That deflected driving rain downward, rather than allowing it to find the gap between the bottom course of wall boards and the ground. She added this apron in November of 1867, after the first heavy southerly rain showed her where the vulnerability was. The neighbors saw the shed going up in September and October of 1867. James Garfield, not the future president, but a farmer 3 holdings east along the road, said to Ruth in October that he had never seen a woodshed built with gaps in the walls, and that a shed with gaps in the walls was barely a shed. She said the gaps were for ventilation to dry the wood. He said that in his experience wood that needed drying went in the barn, not in a shed with holes in it. She said she had found that the barn kept the humidity in and slowed the drying, and the gaps moved the humid air out. He said he would take her word for it, and that he hoped it served her better than an honest board wall would have done. His wife Mary said to Ida at the general store in November that Mrs. Swanson had built herself a peculiar sort of shed that seemed to have been put together with the boards spaced apart rather than tight, which she understood was by design, and that she was not sure a shed with holes in it could be called a proper shed. Ida said that her mother's design was deliberate and that the ventilation was the point. Mary said, "Ventilation for firewood." Ida said, "Yes." Mary said, "I had not thought firewood needed ventilation." Ida said, "That's what my mother thought too, until she compared the burn quality." The winter of 1867–68 was Ruth's first full season with the shed, and the data it provided her continuing record in the farm account book, comparing pieces from the ventilated shed against pieces from the remnant outdoor pile she had not yet transferred, confirmed what she had expected. The shed wood was drier and burned more cleanly throughout the season. She transferred everything to the shed before winter of 1868–69 and kept no outdoor pile after that. The ice storm of February 1869 was the proof she had not planned for, but that the design had already addressed. The storm arrived on the night of February 14th as freezing rain, the specific mid-Atlantic weather event where precipitation falls as rain through air above freezing and then freezes on contact with surfaces that are below freezing. The freezing rain fell continuously from approximately 9 in the evening to 3 in the morning, by which time every outdoor surface in Newcastle County was coated in 3/8 of an inch of clear ice. The outdoor woodpiles, every neighbor's outdoor woodpile, the Garfields and the Hendersons and the Landers, and every other family along the Brandywine Road were encased in ice. The ice layer was not heavy enough to destroy the stacks, but it was heavy enough to cover the split faces of the wood and to soak the top courses through and through as it melted slightly and refroze over the following 2 days of temperatures cycling between 28 and 34 degrees. Ruth's shed was sealed against ice in 2 ways. The tight roof kept the freezing rain from falling on the wood inside, and the wall gaps, which in an ice storm became plugged with ice on their outer surfaces, actually improved the wind seal during the storm, because the ice blocked the wind without preventing the air inside from circulating against the inner surface of the ice plug, which maintained a slightly warmer microclimate inside the shed than the outside air. The wood inside the shed was the same temperature as before the storm, approximately 30 to 32 degrees. The ambient temperature of the shed interior during a Delaware winter cold, and was as dry as it had been the previous week, because no precipitation had reached it. James Garfield came to Ruth's door on the morning of February 15th. He was carrying a bucket and a small hand axe, which were the tools he was using to chip ice off his outdoor pile. He said, "I can't get the top 2 courses open. The axe is breaking the splits rather than the ice, and the wood underneath is soaked." He said, "I have a cord of wood under there, and I can't get to it in a condition I can burn," he said, looking at the covered shed behind Ruth's barn. "I imagine yours is a different situation," she said. "Would you like some?" He said, "I would pay for it." She said, "No." She gave him 2 armloads from the shed, dry, split white oak, the cut faces pale and bone dry to the touch. He held a piece and looked at it. He said, "This is drier than mine was before the storm." She said, "It's been in the shed since October." He said nothing for a moment. He said, "The gaps." She said, "The gaps." He asked her that afternoon to explain the design. She did, at the shed, with the ice still coating everything around it, the ventilating gaps, the elevated floor, the split-only stacking, the alternating cut faces, the overhang and the apron on the south wall. He listened and asked questions and went home. He built his own covered ventilated shed that spring, using the same principles she described, oriented differently because his barn was oriented differently, but with the same gaps and the same elevated floor and the same split-only rule. By the spring of 1870, 4 households along the Brandywine Road had built ventilated woodsheds based on what James Garfield described from Ruth's design. She was consulted by 2 of them, the Hendersons and a younger family named Pierce, who had moved to the valley in 1868, on the specific proportions of the wall gaps and the floor elevation, which she gave from the record she had kept in the farm account book. The Landers consulted James Garfield rather than Ruth directly. which was a choice that told its own story about which sources of expertise were considered natural to consult. But the design they built was Ruth's design, as Garfield had described it. Ruth sold firewood commercially from the shed in the winters of 1870 and 1871, dried split white oak and hickory, sold by the half cord at a price that reflected the wood's quality, to 3 households in the valley, and to the paper mill's foreman's house, whose owner had complained for years that the wet wood his suppliers delivered burned poorly, and asked around for a source of properly dried wood. She received $3.50 per half cord, which was 50 cents above the going rate for ordinary firewood, which she considered reasonable given the quality differential, and which her customers considered reasonable given that the wood they received actually burned. The premium covered the labor of splitting and stacking, and the commercial sales of 2 winters provided enough additional income to replace the kitchen stove, which had been in increasingly poor condition since 1866, with a new Charter oak range that was more efficient and that Ruth would use for the next 20 years. Ida Swanson married a millwright from the DuPont Powder Works in 1871 and moved to Wilmington, and Ruth continued the wood management alone through the 1870s, cutting from the woodlot, splitting at the shed, stacking with the alternating faces, selling commercially each season to a list of customers that had grown to 7 households by 1875. She added a second shed in 1873, identical in design to the first, when the woodlot's production and her customer base had outgrown the original 14 BAT structure. The farm account book in which she had kept the burn quality record since 1865 was still in use in 1875. She had filled it with the wood records and the cow records and the seed records and the commercial firewood sales and the expenses of the shed construction, and it was the primary financial document of the 12-acre holding. It would eventually go with Ida, who kept her mother's papers after Ruth died in 1891, and Ida's daughter donated it to the Delaware Historical Society in 1934, where it is catalogued as Farm Account Book, Newcastle County, Delaware, circa 1862 to 1882, Swanson family, Brandywine Creek area. The annotations in the back, the burn quality records from 1865 onward, the ventilated shed design notes from the autumn of 1867, the moisture comparison data are noted in the catalogue description as documenting an early application of controlled wood storage for combustion quality improvement. The Delaware Historical Society archivist, who wrote the catalogue description in 1934, was a man who knew something about wood drying, having grown up in the lumber trade, and he recognized in the farm account book's back pages the specific observations of a person who had worked out, by systematic recording and comparison, the same principles that commercial lumber drying operations had been applying since the mid-19th century: ventilation, elevated storage, end grain exposure, and separation of cut surfaces. He noted in his catalogue annotation that the farm account book predated the publication of several standard texts on wood drying for fuel purposes, and represented an independent derivation of established principles from practical observation. Ruth had not known she was deriving established principles. She had known that some wood burned better than other wood, and she had paid attention to why, and she had built what the attention showed her was needed, and it had worked exactly as well as the attention indicated it would work. The gaps in the walls of the shed were not a peculiar construction choice, or a mistaken one. They were the correct answer to the specific problem of keeping mid-Atlantic firewood dry through a mid-Atlantic winter, arrived at by a woman who kept records of what she observed, and built what the records showed was necessary. The ice storm of February 1869 did not teach her anything she had not already known. It demonstrated, to her neighbors and to the valley generally, what she had established to her own satisfaction by 2 seasons of comparative observation. James Garfield's comment, "The gaps," was the summary of the lesson in 2 words. In the same way that Lisa Ojala's "The rock is better" had been the summary of another lesson in 3 words. In both cases the lesson was not new knowledge. It was the correct application of available facts, verified by systematic observation, and demonstrated by an event that the observer had not predicted, but that the design had already addressed. The wood in the shed was dry. The wood in the outdoor piles was ice-coated and soaked. The difference was the shed. The shed was the gaps and the elevated floor, and the split faces and the overhang and the apron on the south wall. Ruth had built all of them for reasons she could explain from the records she had kept, and she explained them to James Garfield that afternoon in February, with the ice still coating everything around the shed and the dry wood in her arms, giving off the specific pale color and hard sound of wood that is ready to burn. She had known it was ready. She had been keeping track since 1865. The specific physics of wood drying, which Ruth arrived at by observation, and James Garfield summarized as the gaps, is worth stating precisely, because precision reveals both the correctness of her design and the nature of the reasoning that produced it. Greenwood freshly cut timber contains moisture in two forms: free water in the cell cavities and bound water in the cell walls. Free water leaves the wood relatively easily as the wood dries. It is simply water in open spaces, and it moves to the surface by capillary action and evaporates. Bound water is held by chemical bonds to the cellulose of the cell walls and requires the disruption of those bonds to release. It leaves the wood more slowly and requires lower ambient humidity around the wood surface to maintain the gradient that drives the moisture out. Air-dried firewood in the mid-Atlantic climate, Delaware, Maryland, Pennsylvania, typically requires 6 to 12 months to reach the moisture content at which it burns cleanly. Below approximately 20%, measured by weight. Wood above 20% moisture burns with a visible steam component in the smoke, deposits creosote on chimney surfaces, and produces significantly less usable heat per unit weight, because a portion of the combustion energy is spent vaporizing the moisture rather than producing heat. The difference in usable heat output between 30% moisture wood and 15% moisture wood is approximately 25%, a substantial fraction of the energy available from the wood. The drying rate depends on three factors. Temperature: warmer is faster, humidity of the surrounding air dryer is faster, and airflow over the wood surface more is faster. Ruth's covered shed optimized all three. The shed wall's 3/4-inch gaps provided continuous airflow through the stored wood. Even on still days, the temperature difference between the interior and exterior of the shed slightly warmer inside, from the limited solar gain through the south wall gaps, created a convective draft. On windy days, the gaps allowed the wind to move air across the wood surfaces directly. In either case, the moisture expelled from the wood surface was continuously replaced by drier outside air, keeping the humidity gradient between wood surface and ambient air at its maximum value, and therefore keeping the drying rate at its maximum value. The floor elevation prevented ground moisture, which in the Brandywine Valley clay soils was substantial, the ground holding water for weeks after rain, from wicking up through the stacked wood. The bottom course of wood on a ground contact stack is in vapor contact with the ground, which in Delaware autumn and winter is at or near saturation. The 12-inch elevation, with air flowing under the floor between the split rail floor pieces, placed the bottom course of wood in contact with the shed air rather than the ground air, maintaining the same drying gradient for all courses. The split-only rule maximized the surface area of wood exposed to the drying airflow. A round log presents only its outer surface and its two end-grain faces to the air. A split piece presents both the outer surface and the two interior cut faces, which are the fastest drying surfaces because the grain is open to the air. Splitting a round into quarters increases the drying surface area by approximately 3 times and reduces the average distance from the wood center to a drying surface by approximately half, which reduces the drying time by more than half. The alternating cut face stacking maximized the airflow contact with those cut faces throughout the stack rather than concentrating it at the ends. In a conventional stack with all cut faces aligned in the same direction, the interior of the stack has limited air exchange. The cut faces of one piece are against the round surface of the adjacent piece, and the airflow through the stack is along the stack length rather than across the cut surfaces. In Ruth's alternating stack, the cut faces of each piece are adjacent to the cut faces of the neighboring pieces and exposed to the cross-stack airflow that the wall gaps produced. Each element of the design addressed a specific mechanism of moisture retention, and together they produced a storage environment in which wood dried approximately twice as fast as in a conventional outdoor pile and 3 times as fast as in a closed barn. The 12-month drying time for unprotected mid-Atlantic firewood was, in Ruth's shed, reduced to 3 to 5 months, meaning that wood she cut in June and July and stacked in the shed in August was ready for clean burning by November or December of the same year. She did not calculate this from first principles. She observed the difference in burn quality between pieces stored different lengths of time under different conditions, recorded the observations in the farm account book, and drew the conclusions the observations supported. The conclusions happened to be correct, and the design she built from them happened to address the physics correctly. This is the normal path by which practical knowledge becomes established: systematic observation, recorded comparison, and design based on the pattern the comparison reveals. The archivist's 1934 observation that the farm account book represented an independent derivation of established principles was accurate in its substance but slightly misleading in its framing. The established principles to which he referred were established in the lumber industry in the context of structural timber and dimensional lumber, where moisture content affects the dimensions and strength of the wood rather than its combustion properties. The application to firewood, where the relevant outcome is heat per unit weight and ease of ignition rather than dimensional stability, was not a published application in 1865 when Ruth began her records. She was not deriving established principles in the sense of rediscovering known knowledge. She was developing appropriate knowledge for a specific application that had not been systematically addressed in the published literature of the period. Whether this makes her derivation more or less significant is a question of how one values independent discovery versus application of known principles. The wood in her shed burned better than the wood in the outdoor piles. The improvement was real and measurable and consistent across seasons and replicated by the neighbors who followed her design. The physics that explains the improvement is the physics of wood drying, which is the same physics regardless of whether Ruth had read about it. She had not read about it. She had observed it. The Brandywine Creek Valley in 1869 had approximately 40 households within 3 miles of Ruth's holding on either side of the creek, ranging from the large farms of the established families, the Brintons and the Pools and the DuPonts themselves, who owned both the powder works and considerable farmland, to the small holdings of mill workers and tradesmen who had established themselves in the valley during the industrial expansion of the 1840s and 1850s. The Swanson holding was on the smaller end of the range, 12 acres, a two-story frame house of Swedish-influenced construction, a barn, and the woodlot, adequate for a family's self-sufficiency if managed carefully. The Swedish-influenced construction of the house was a legacy of the first Swanson to come to the Brandywine Valley. Ruth's husband's grandfather, who had arrived from Sweden in 1798 and had built the original structure in a style that combined American frame construction with the Swedish tradition of tight joinery and careful attention to wood quality. The house had been added to and modified over 3 generations. But the original core of it, the first floor rooms and the kitchen, retained the heavy timber framing and the specific way of fitting boards that characterized the Swedish-American building tradition of the Delaware River Valley. Ruth had been born in Chester County, Pennsylvania, and had come to the Brandywine holding when she married Carl in 1851. She was not Swedish. Her family name before marriage was Hartley, and her people were English Quakers who had been in Pennsylvania since the 1680s. She had absorbed the Swedish-influenced construction sensibility of the Swanson property through 17 years of living in it and maintaining it. She had replaced siding boards, repointed the stone foundation, resheathed the barn roof, and rebuilt the porch framing. And in each of these projects, she had encountered the specific logic of construction that Carl and his father had applied, the logic that favored tight joints over approximate ones, with selection for the specific application, rather than whatever was available, and the use of drainage and ventilation to extend the life of exposed wood. The covered woodshed was an extension of this tradition. The elevated floor that prevented ground moisture contact was the same principle as the stone pier foundation of the house that prevented soil contact with the sill beams. The ventilated walls were the same principle as the soffitted EV detail of the barn that prevented moisture accumulation in the rafter tails. The split-tonally stacking rule was consistent with the Swedish-American tradition of treating wood as a material with specific properties that rewarded attention rather than something to be forced into service, regardless of condition. She had not thought of the shed in these terms. She had thought, the wood is wet, and the wet wood burns poorly, and the porch alcove is too small, and I need a larger covered space with the airflow that the porch alcove has. She had built what the thought required, using the construction sensibility she had absorbed from 17 years in the Swanson holding. The sensibility was the inheritance she had been working within without naming it. Carl would have built the same shed, she thought, If he had been healthy in 1867, he had agreed with the idea when she proposed it, and the elevated floor and the ventilating gaps were consistent with the way he thought about wood and moisture. He had not thought to build it in the years when he was healthy. The outdoor pile had been good enough. The tarp had been adequate in most years. The ice storms came infrequently enough that the wet wood problem was a temporary inconvenience rather than a structural deficiency. It took the winter of 1865, when she was managing the wood alone for the first time and paying closer attention to the burn quality because she had no surplus of effort and could not afford to tend a poor burning fire more often than a good burning one. To make the structural deficiency visible, necessity had sharpened the observation. The observation had produced the design. The design had worked. James Garfield built his ventilated shed in the spring of 1869, using the dimensions Ruth gave him and the same rough-sawn chestnut from the Brandywine sawmill. He varied the roof pitch from Ruth's because his barn wall faced a different direction, and he wanted the shed's south face to receive more direct winter sun, which he thought would help the drying. Ruth told him the sun contribution was real, but smaller than the ventilation contribution, and that the south face orientation was good for the limited solar input but should not be the primary consideration. He built it with the south face orientation and the ventilating gaps and the elevated floor and the split-only rule, and the shed performed comparably to Ruth's through the following winters. He described it to the other families in the valley as Mrs. Swanson's design, which was accurate, and which was the attribution she would have given herself. The description spread through the Brandywine Valley community in the way that useful, practical knowledge spreads in a rural community, person to person, season to season, each new builder referring to the person who had explained it to them. By 1875, there were 11 ventilated woodsheds along the Brandywine Road between the Swanson Holding and the creek's confluence with the Christina River. All of them descended from Ruth's 1867 design, most of them built with slight variations that reflected the specific situation of the builder's barn and woodlot, and the specific conversation they had had with the person who told them about it. Ruth was aware of the sheds because she could see several of them from the road on her trips to the Wilmington market, and because the families that had built them sometimes asked her questions about gap width, about the species of wood for the sill beams, about whether to use shingles or board and batten for the roof. She answered the questions from the record she had kept, and from the 7 seasons of experience she had accumulated by 1875, and the answers were consistent because the record was consistent and the experience had confirmed it. She took a quiet satisfaction in this that was specific to the satisfaction of having been right about something that had been questioned. James Garfield had said a shed with gaps in the walls was barely a shed. He had built one with gaps in the walls as soon as he understood what the gaps did. The gap was the point. The gap had been the point in 1867 when she designed it, and in 1869 when she explained it to him at the shed with the ice coating everything around them and the dry wood in her arms. He had understood it in 1869. He had built it in 1869. He had told the valley about it in 1870, and after. The ice storm had been the demonstration. She had not needed the demonstration herself. She had known the design worked from 2 seasons of comparative records before the ice storm came. But the demonstration was what made the knowledge visible to everyone else. And visible knowledge travels faster than invisible knowledge in a rural community where the relevant information is what works and what doesn't in the conditions everyone shares. The conditions of the Brandywine Valley in the 1870s, the wet winters, the ice storms, the wood that came from mixed hardwood lots and arrived green and needed months to dry. The stoves that required well-dried wood to burn efficiently were conditions that Ruth had been solving for since 1865. She had solved them correctly. The shed was the solution. The gaps were the shed. The wood in the shed was dry. In February of 1869, it was the only dry firewood for 3 miles in any direction. The ice had seen to that. The farm account books burn quality records from 1865 through 1875 document something that was not their stated purpose. The progressive refinement of a systematic observation practiced by a person who had no formal training in systematic observation. The first entries in October of 1865 are rough. A note that the porch alcove wood burns better than the pile wood, with no specific comparison of timing or moisture condition. By November of 1865, the entries begin to include the number of days the piece had been under cover before burning. By January of 1866 they include the cut date, the species, the cover duration, and a 3-level quality assessment: burns well, burns adequately, burns poorly. By October of 1867, when the shed was under construction, the entries include a 4th column that records the location where the wood was stored: porch alcove, old outdoor pile, new shed, alongside the other variables. This progression from qualitative observation to multivariable systematic comparison was driven by a practical goal rather than a scientific one. Ruth wanted to know what she should do with her wood to make it burn well, and the records were the tool for finding out. But the method she developed to answer the practical question was the method that careful inquiry requires regardless of its goal. Identify the variables. Hold most of them constant, while varying one. Record the outcome. Repeat. The farm account book's back pages show the development of this method over 3 years, not as a formal design but as the natural consequence of caring enough about the answer to keep looking for it systematically. She was not doing science in the sense of pursuing knowledge for its own sake. She was solving a problem that cost her money and effort every time it was solved incorrectly. The incentive was specific and economic. Wet wood meant more wood consumed per unit of heat, which meant more cutting, more splitting, more cost, more time. Dry wood meant less of all of those things. The improvement in efficiency that properly dried wood provided was not small. She estimated in the 1872 entries, when she had enough data to make the comparison, that the shed had reduced her annual wood consumption by approximately 1/3, from 1.5 cords to approximately 1 cord, because she was getting the same heat output from less wood that was fully dried rather than more wood that was partially wet. 1/3 of a cord at the merchant price was approximately $2 per year. Over 5 years, minus 1,868 through 1872, that was $10 saved on wood consumption alone, not counting the commercial sales premium or the reduction in the labor of cutting and splitting the additional 3rd cord. The shed had cost approximately $12 to build in materials and labor: the rough sawn chestnut boards, the shingles, the floor rails, the sill beams, the hardware. It had paid for itself in 5 years through wood savings and had continued earning through the commercial sales. The economics were unambiguous, and they had been the implicit justification for the shed from the beginning, even before Ruth had enough data to state them explicitly. This was the practical test of good design in a small holding context. Did it pay for itself, and how quickly? The covered ventilated shed passed the test in 5 years. The outdoor pile had been the standard for as long as anyone in the valley had been keeping wood, and the standard had perpetuated because the problem it failed to solve, wet wood in ice storms, was intermittent. Ice storms came every few years, rather than every year, and the wet wood after an ice storm was a temporary inconvenience that passed. When the weather moderated and the ice melted off the pile, the annual moisture problem, the wood that never fully dried because it was never covered in a ventilated space, was less visible than the ice storm problem because it was continuous rather than acute. The burn quality was always somewhat reduced, and the wood consumption was always somewhat higher than it needed to be, but neither was obvious in isolation. What Ruth's records made visible was the baseline comparison. Here is how wood burns when it has been kept in the right conditions, and here is how it burns when it has not. The comparison was not available until she made it, and making it required keeping the records. The records required caring enough about the question to write down the answers over multiple seasons. She cared because the wood cost her effort, and the effort was hers alone. The situation clarified the incentive, and the incentive produced the method, and the method produced the design, and the design produced the dry wood. In the shed, on the morning of February 15, 1869, when James Garfield came to her door with a bucket and a hand axe, and the problem that the ice had made visible in a single night, he took the 2 armloads of dry white oak and went home. He came back in the afternoon and asked her to explain the design. She explained it from the records and from the 7 seasons of observation the records represented. He built it in the spring. He told the valley about it. 11 sheds descended from the design by 1875. The wood in Ruth's shed was dry in February of 1869. The wood in the outdoor piles was coated in 3/8 of an inch of ice and soaked underneath. The difference was the design. The design was the records. The records were the attention she had been paying since October of 1865, when the wood in the porch alcove burned better than the wood in the pile, and she wrote it down and kept going from there. She had been keeping going from there for 4 years before the ice storm. The ice storm was not the beginning of anything. It was the end of the question of whether the shed was worth the construction, and the neighbors' amusement at a woodshed with gaps in its walls. The gaps were the point. They had always been the point. James Garfield's shed, built in the spring of 1869 with the same gaps, confirmed this. The Hendersons' shed, built the following year, confirmed it again. The 11 sheds along the Brandywine Road by 1875 confirmed it collectively. The Delaware Historical Society archivist, who read the farm account book in 1934 and wrote his catalogue note about an early application of controlled wood storage, confirmed it from the documentary record. The wood was dry. The shed was right. She had known since 1867, from 2 seasons of comparative records, that both of these things were true. The ice storm of 1869 was the most dramatic demonstration of what was already established. She gave James Garfield the wood. She explained the design. She watched the valley build the sheds. She had been right. The records showed it. The gaps proved it. The ice storm demonstrated it. She had known it would. The specific variety of American chestnut that Ruth used for the shed construction, the boards and the shingles and the sill beams, except the oak sills, was itself a fact about the Brandywine Valley in 1867 that would become unavailable within 50 years. The American chestnut blight, caused by the fungus Cryphonectria parasitica introduced from Asia around 1900, would kill virtually every mature American chestnut in the eastern United States by the 1940s. A forest catastrophe that eliminated a tree that had constituted approximately a quarter of the eastern deciduous forest canopy, and that had been the preferred wood for fence rails, barns, and general construction throughout the Appalachian and Mid-Atlantic region for its combination of lightness, ease of splitting, rot resistance, and straight grain. In 1867, American chestnut was abundant and cheap in the Brandywine Valley. The valley's hillsides held stands of mature chestnut that had been growing since before the Swedish settlers arrived, and the Brandywine sawmill cut and sold chestnut boards at a price that reflected its availability. Ruth paid $11.40 for the boards and shingles for the shed from the sawmill's standard inventory. The same construction in 1920 would have required pine or cedar and would have cost more. And the specific qualities of the chestnut, its light weight, and the ease with which it split for shingles, would have been harder to replicate. She did not know this. She was using the best available material for the purpose at hand. And in 1867, in the Brandywine Valley, the best available material was American chestnut. The shed she built from it survived into the 20th century. The last documented reference to it in the historical record is a photograph taken in 1912 by Ida Swanson Perkins's son, who was visiting the Brandywine, holding on a summer day, and photographed the property. The shed is visible in the background of the photograph. Slightly weathered, but structurally intact, 45 years after construction, the ventilating gap pattern still visible in the chestnut board walls. The chestnut boards had outlasted the species that produced them. The blight had reached Newcastle County by 1912, and the mature chestnuts in the valley's woodlots were dead or dying. But the seasoned boards in the shed walls were untouched, sealed by the decades of exposure and the natural extractives in the chestnut heartwood that gave it its rot resistance. The photograph is in the Delaware Historical Society collection, alongside the farm account book. The catalogue note describes it as showing the outbuildings of the Swanson property circa 1912, and mentions the ventilated woodshed as the structure visible at the right edge of the image. The chestnut boards with their 3/4-inch gaps are visible to anyone who looks at the photograph and knows what to look for. The design is legible in the material. She had built it to last and to work. 45 years later, it was still doing both. The winter of 1872-71, the third full season with the shed, was the season Ruth began selling firewood commercially. The decision followed directly from the records. She had documentation showing that her wood reached burn-ready moisture content by November from a June-July cut, and that the shed's capacity, approximately 2 cords when fully stacked, exceeded her household's annual consumption of approximately 1 cord. The half-cord surplus was available for sale, and the quality of the wood was demonstrably superior to the ordinary firewood available from wood merchants, who delivered green or poorly dried wood that their customers burned with the usual inefficiency. The paper mill foreman, whose house she supplied beginning in November 1870, was her most reliable commercial customer through the 1870s. He had complained in the past about the quality of wood from the standard merchant deliveries, and had asked around the valley for a source of wood that was properly dried. James Garfield mentioned Mrs. Swanson's shed. The foreman came to look at the wood and bought a half cord on the spot, and returned for a half cord every winter through 1877, when the family moved to Wilmington. Ruth charged $3.50 per half cord, which was 50 cents above the standard merchant rate. The premium reflected the quality differential. Her wood ignited reliably, burned cleanly, deposited less creosote, and produced more heat per piece. Customers who had bought once returned because the difference was real and quantifiable in their own experience. Their stoves performed better on her wood, required less tending, and lasted longer on each loading. The 50-cent premium was not a hardship. It was a reasonable price for a measurable improvement. The commercial sales over 7 years minus 1,870 through 1877, before Ida married and Ruth reduced her cutting to household needs, totaled approximately 42 half cords at $3.50, or $147. This was not a large sum by any measure of commercial enterprise, but it was substantial relative to the household's annual income of approximately $130 to $150 from the farm. It paid for the Charter Oak Range, the second shed in 1873, and the repairs to the barn roof in 1875, and it did so from wood that the household was producing anyway, from the managed woodlot, with the only additional investment being the correct storage that the shed provided. She kept the commercial sale records in the farm account book, alongside the burn quality records, date, customer, species, volume, price, and a note on any feedback the customer provided about the wood's performance. The feedback column, which she added in 1872, is the most legible part of the commercial record to a modern reader because it is the customer's words rather than her numbers. Burns well and clean, no complaints, asked for more of the same hickory, said it was the best wood he had burned in 10 years. The last note, from the paper mill foreman in November of 1876, reads, said he wished he had found this source 5 years sooner. She had been available 5 years sooner. He had simply not heard of her until James Garfield mentioned the shed. The knowledge had been in the valley since 1869. It traveled when someone made the connection.